Greetings all, Ferrari Matt 601 here. Welcome to another 1/18th scale Formula One model review. This, the 2010 Ferrari F10, as driven by Felipe Massa in the 2010 Formula One season. The 2010 F1 regulations, they heralded basically the beginning of what we would now call the modern era. For 2010, probably the biggest rule change was that refueling was banned for the first time since the end of the 1993 season. This meant that the cars had to start the race with all the fuel they would need to complete the race distance. This required a few pretty large design changes in the cars, namely the overall lengthening of the car's wheelbase so that they could accommodate a larger fuel tank. This is probably the biggest characteristic that we can see distinguishing the Ferrari F10 from its immediate predecessor, the F60 of 2009. Let's take a look at this model here. This is the Mattel Hot Wheels version of the Ferrari F10. Mattel back in these days had the exclusive Ferrari license to produce the models in any scale for the most part, so this is what we have got. As we have mentioned, the design changes necessitated by the 2010 regulations, they meant that the wheelbases on the cars had to get longer, although for the most part the regulations from the end of 2009 were kept pretty much intact. 2009, of course, saw the introduction of a raft of aerodynamic changes aimed at improving overtaking prospects. However, as we would later see as those regulations developed, overtaking really wasn't helped all that much by those regulations. However, the 2009 regs, they necessitated the construction of the front wings, as we can see here. They're very wide, they're very low, and they're not all that complicated, particularly when we compare them to the front wings of the 2018 Formula One cars. Despite them being very similar in their size and macrocosmic shape, these wings, as you can see here, evidenced by these flap elements, they're very simplistic. Nowadays we have multiple flap elements on the main plane of the wing itself, and then we also have cascade elements which come off from either the center section of the primary flap or they actually sprout out from the end plates inboard, and they generate a lot of downforce, but they also generate a lot of turbulent air. This was not really the case going into 2010. As we can see, the front wing here of the Ferrari, very simplistic. The only sorts of cascade elements that we can see here are just here in this area. You couldn't really call them cascades as much as you can call them just secondary winglets just sprouting out from the end fences there, and as you can see, the end plates proper. Actually not all that dissimilar from what we see in 2018, but still you can see that this car, despite being only 8 years old, looks very dated, at least from the front end. Of course, moving the rears on the car, you can see we have a double wishbone pushrod suspension on this car. Ferrari would later experiment with a pull rod configuration on their front ends. However, they have since gone back to a pushrod configuration, and all of the Formula One cars have been using a double wishbone pushrod suspension since the start of the 2017 season. So everybody still using this overall suspension geometry, even now, 8 years after this car was racing. Moving across toward the middle section of the front end, we can see here some small barge boards. The 2009 regulations effectively outlawed barge boards. However, by 2010, the second year of that regulation package, the engineers started to figure out where the loopholes were in those rules so that they started to get the barge boards back to some extent. Much smaller than we, of course, saw on Formula One cars in the beginning of the 2000s, toward the end of the 90s as well, but some barge board activity here, the white winglet there with the Santander branding. More important on the midsections of these cars in this era was the treatment of the cockpit wing mirrors as well as the turning vanes. Now, this comes from a liberal interpretation of the rules. The mirrors, basically, they didn't have any rules governing where they could be placed. The regulations simply mandated a minimum size for the mirror, and basically it's common sense that in order for the driver to use the mirrors, he has to be able to see them. Well, quite clearly, if you put these mirrors where they are on the sides of the cockpit, the driver can turn his head and he can see those mirrors. Well, that sounds pretty convincing enough. However, what Ferrari and of course other teams also were starting to do with these mirrors was they were, technically speaking, putting them on these supports very far outboard on the side pods of the car, actually extended out and slightly ahead of the side pods. And those supports just happened to serve the dual purpose of supporting the mirrors as well as guiding the airflow. And this gave rise to the turning vanes that we can see on this car as well as on pretty much all of the other Formula One cars of this era. The idea is the car comes through the air moves toward the midsection in this direction, interfaces in this surface between the turning vane or mirror support and the side pod, and then it gets funneled around the side of the car toward the rear zone and the diffuser. Speaking of diffusers, diffusers were very important in 2009 as well as in 2010 when this car was racing, because the regulations prohibited all of the little chimneys and winglets that we saw on Formula One cars from the late 2000s, 2006 through 2008 really. The designers had to get a little bit more creative in terms of how they were going to be generating that downforce. So if you could keep the floor relatively free of obstructions and maintain that gap between the side pod and the reference plane here, you could basically funnel as much air as you wanted down into the rear zone and the diffuser, which we can see right in here. The top side of the diffuser in that area, as well as the rear suspension, which we can still see is double wishbone and pushrod on this Ferrari. Now, the more air you can funnel back there, the more downforce your diffuser is going to generate. We remember in 2009 when Braun, Williams, and Toyota debuted a double-decker diffuser solution. Well, we can kind of get a glimpse of that thinking in 2010 as well on this Ferrari. Here we can see the rear zone and the diffuser. This is a multi-element diffuser with several levels to it. We have, of course, the primary strakes in the lower surface of the diffuser, really there in the floor section, but we also have another element of this diffuser. Getting the light together is a little bit of a challenge, but we can see that we have the legality plank at the bottom of that car, and then we have a tunnel that sort of forms between the plank and the diffuser itself, and then we have a secondary tunnel in the upper element of the diffuser there, that roughly trapezoidal shape that you can see there. Very interesting and innovative solution. Beyond that, though, on the top side of the car, we can see this further tunnel in the diffuser solution integrated into the rear crash structure a little bit and the gearbox casing. That is how Ferrari were generating a lot of their downforce, particularly at the rear zone, obviously, in 2010. And that's what enabled this car to be rather competitive. No, it was not a match for the Red Bull RB6 in challenging for the World Championship. However, this car has a competition record of 5 wins from 19 races, 15 podium finishes, 2 pole positions, and 5 fastest laps. And of course, it was driven by Felipe Massa, who we see here, as well as Fernando Alonso in his first year with Ferrari. In terms of the technical specifications on the car, designed by Aldo Costa, who is then technical director at Ferrari, it has the traditional carbon fiber honeycomb composite chassis construction that you'd expect to see in Formula One, basically going back through the early 1980s when McLaren debuted the carbon composite monocoque. Independent suspension on all 4 corners, pushrod activated, of course. The engine in this car, 2.4 liter V8, is the Ferrari Type 056. Basically the same engine that was introduced on the 248 F1 in 2006, as the engine regulations really didn't change from 2006 to 2010. However, the rev limit was dropped from there being basically no limit in 2006 to 19,000 RPM for 2007, and then by 2009, 18,000 RPM. So this engine here revving to 18,000 RPM. 7-speed plus reverse semi-automatic paddle-actuated gearbox at the back, transmitting some 800 horsepower to the rear axle here. Now, what Mattel gave us on this car, it is a step up from their product line of the mid-2000s for sure. Yes, I do have several Mattel models of the mid-2000s Ferraris, and sometimes the quality on them is a little bit to be desired, particularly on the F60 from 2009. However, this one definitely is in much better condition than the F60. On the F60 model, there are no exhaust pipes. The exhaust outlets are modeled on that one, but they're just holes in the bodywork. This one has proper exhaust pipes, as you can see on either side of the chassis. actual pipes being modeled in there in addition to all of this heat-treated carbon, basically to allow the exhaust to attach itself and have a little bit of interaction here in the rear zone on this beam wing as well as on the suspension uprights. You can see here the upper wishbones. Not bad detail there. Also on this model, we can see these gills cut into the side of the side pod. These are the radiator exits. They're basically trying to emulate the function of the chimneys that we had in this area of the car in the mid-2000s. Those were, again, radiator outlets, but they were able to send that air toward the rear in a little bit more precise a fashion. On this car, obviously the regulations banned all of those little winglets and chimneys. Ferrari trying to emulate those effects as much as they can. Front of the side pods, radiator detail here, and if we get the light in there correctly, you can see that there is actually a radiator matrix inside there. It's a little bit difficult to see, but it is there. You can see that there is a pattern anyway of that radiator matrix. Very, very cool. And then, of course, having a look at the rear zone of the car from the side, you can see that we have a big prominent shark fin on this car, and it is actually attached to the rear wing there at the end. This is pre-DRS. DRS would come into Formula One starting in 2011. However, the idea of trying to stall the rear wing, basically negate its effectiveness at generating downforce in order to generate less drag as well. This was something that came on everybody's radar in 2010. McLaren were the first to introduce a system that later became known as the F-duct. Now, on the McLaren's rear wing, there was Vodafone branding here, and where the F was in Vodafone was where McLaren had their shark fin attached. Inside McLaren's fin, unlike you see here on the Ferrari, this is early season spec, McLaren's fin was not basically flat. McLaren's fin had ductwork going through it and then entering the rear wing flap element. What the McLarens were able to do at the beginning of the season was they had a duct coming into the front of the chassis at this point roughly, and the duct would track all through the monocoque and into the cockpit, where the driver was able to move his left hand off of the steering wheel and onto the side of the chassis and cover a little air bleed hole that was in the side of the cockpit where that ductwork was. When he did that, a little valve inside the ductwork, which then went through the car into the shark fin, would slam shut and reroute air from the cockpit, where it was basically there cooling the driver, to the rear wing. The interference of the flow coming through the rear wing and actually exiting the wing through a slot gap at the top was enough to counteract the onrushing flow coming into the wing and generating downforce, so that it basically stalled the wing. It put the wing into a high angle of attack stall like you would get on an aircraft, and that was enough basically to negate the rear downforce generation by the rear wing and gain the car about 20 kilometers an hour down the straights. It was effectively the first modern interpretation of what effectively became known as DRS by 2011. Nowadays, the rear flap, it will actually open up the slot gap and negate the rear wing's downforce as well as drag generation in that manner. But that was what the F-duct did in 2010. McLaren were the first to debut the system, and I remember in pre-season testing, we were all wondering, why does the McLaren have this weird duct on the front of the chassis, and then why does it seem to continue to the rear wing? And also, I remember seeing a picture of the McLaren from Jerez, I believe it was, and they had a hole in the rear wing with the shark fin removed, and we were all wondering, what are they doing with that? Well, that's what they were doing. By not too far along in the season, Ferrari had copied the idea, and then later on, I remember by Spa, even Renault had copied the idea. So the F-duct was there to stay. It was a big element of car development in 2010. However, the FIA said, well, no more of that, but we'll raise you one. We'll give you DRS. We'll let you actually open up the rear wing down the straights and get your straight line speed that way. They were slightly concerned about safety because the drivers were taking their hands off of the steering wheel, sometimes through high-speed corners, and basically that meant that they would, in theory, have less control authority over the vehicle. Now, of course, in practice, Formula One drivers are among the best racing drivers in the world. They know exactly what they're doing. But the FIA didn't like the system, and also they couldn't tell when a driver was using it unless they could physically see them moving their hand or moving their leg in the cockpit to cover up that hole. So being that they didn't always have access to the onboard cameras when the cars were on track, they couldn't police when this system was engaged. From the outside of the car, there was no visual difference at all between the F-duct engaged or the F-duct not engaged. So the FIA needed to police that, hence DRS was conceived. In terms of what else we've got going on this model, this one is actually rather unique as far as the Mattel Ferrari models go, namely because of the branding that we have on here. Notice the shark fin and engine cover, they have this barcoding on it. Now, yeah, it looks like a barcode, but notice the colors, the red and the black, very clearly. This is some subliminal advertising for Marlboro, that Marlboro cigarette brand. Yes, Ferrari not allowed to put any tobacco branding, no team allowed to put any tobacco branding on their cars, basically since 2008, but Ferrari did run this very sneaky barcode for quite a few races in 2010, and they got away with it. Eventually, Ferrari were forced to remove this barcode branding because they said, that looks too similar to the brand name of that particular cigarette company. So the European Union, with their television rules, they didn't want cigarette advertising on live TV, so, well, Ferrari had to remove that. But this is what we had on the Ferrari at the beginning of the year. Other details that we have on this model. We'll get in closer and take a look in the cockpit. Obviously, no details of any F-duct work in here, but you can see reasonable likeness of Felipe Massa and reasonable enough details on the steering wheel. There are no three-dimensional figures on that steering wheel. It's just all decals, but it looks accurate enough when you think about what the 2010 Ferrari steering wheel looked like. In addition to that, we have pretty good driver detail here on Felipe Massa. Nice helmet livery there. And that is not the white visor, that is the tinted visor. Malaysia 2009, do you remember? Anyway, yep, good detail on the cockpit surround. You can see Massa's name there, replete with a little Ferrari logo and a little Marlboro barcode logo, and that is reiterated here on the side of the monocoque. Very cool. Emergency kill switch for the marshals should the car stop on track and need to be shut down. The driver, for some reason, can't do that himself. And then that's basically it in terms of sponsorship on this car. You see we have some contingency decals down here. Acer, Tata, the Ferrari sponsors of the day. But that's basically it. Of course, fuel supplier Shell. And then, yeah, Santander, the Ferrari logo, Etihad Airways. And that's about it. Ferrari getting a lot of money from Philip Morris and the Marlboro brand despite not being able to advertise them out in the open. But that's basically what they were doing back in the day. Also, you'll notice the tires on this car, Bridgestone Potenza. This was the last year, 2010, for the Bridgestone tire supply contract in Formula One. Therefore, all the cars were running Bridgestone tires in 2010. Bridgestone pulled out at the end of 2010, and Pirelli came in for the 2011 season. And here in 2018, we are still running Pirellis on all of the Formula One cars. Love them or hate them, that is the situation. No Bridgestone in Formula One since 2010. I do have to say, the overall details on this model, it's pretty good. No, it's not as good as a lot of the Mini Champs models that would come either before or after this one, but still, not really anything to sneeze at here. I do like just how intricate and precise the pitot tube is here, this section of the monocoque, as well as the little aerial. These are not that flexible, and they'd be very easy to knock off there, so definitely watch, especially when you're going to pick this car up. Don't pick it up from this side, for sure. Additionally to that, we have other details. The steering, as you can see, that works quite well. Also, another detail that I just remembered, have a look at these front wheels. Do you remember in 2007 when the team started to experiment with these wheel fairings to try and control the outwash from the front wing? And this is actually something that's coming up again in the 2019 regulations, changing the front wings a little bit. What the teams did was, starting in 2007, they started to put these fairings around the outer surface of the front wheels, and some teams even did it on the rear wheels as well later on. The idea was, again, just trying to control the outwash from that front wing to try and reduce turbulence. That's as those vortices, they spill out from the end plates there and they interface with the tires, or they become even bigger vortices, and it really spoils the efficiency of the air as it twirls its way back into the floor. So they put these fairings on their front wheels. For 2010, the FIA said, no, those are illegal because they were removable. They had to be removed in the pit stop to change the tires. So what some of the more moneyed teams like Ferrari started to do was they just molded into the actual rim design these little discs. And yes, they are structurally parts of the wheel rather than part of the brake duct, as the initial fairings had been. They were considered to be part of the brake duct, even though they were actually independent from the front wheels. Part of the reason the FIA banned them was that they really had a tendency to come off on track. Remember Nürburgring 2007? That happened. What didn't happen in that race? That's the better question. But yep, those fairings were coming off on track. The FIA said, no, you can't do that anymore, so they made that as part of the structure of the wheel instead. We're not really seeing the teams doing this anymore as the FIA continued to clamp down on those designs. Other than that, though, really not too much else to talk about on this model. Just want to show you again from the cockpit, the steering working. There you go. You turn the front wheels and the steering wheel, it does move, so they are physically linked in there. I always like that detail on a model car when the steering actually works and the steering wheel turns with the steered wheels. Definitely like that a lot. All in all, though, this model, again, it's the Felipe Massa one. You could argue that perhaps this one is not as desirable as the Fernando Alonso model, but I like it. I got this at the end of 2010 when it was released. So, yep, definitely I like this one. It's been in my collection for about 8 years. And yeah, it's, I guess, turn of the decade Ferrari, if you want to talk about it like that. But it is. It's a 2010 car, and I quite like it. Like pretty much all of my other model cars, it doesn't see the light of day too much, and I know that it hasn't been on the channel yet, so I just figured that perhaps I would show it to all of you. Maybe some of you have this model as well. It's not one of the rarer ones. They did make a lot of these back in 2010 and early 2011, so they are still out there on the internet. You can still find them new, but because all of these models do have limited production runs, not so much in numbers, but in years, they only make them for about 6 months or so. So once they stop making them, they usually don't reissue them. So if you've got one, hang on to it. If you can find one at a reasonable price, I remember this one cost me $135 back in 2010. So something like this now probably would go for around $200 to maybe $250 if you're getting gouged a little bit. But yeah, if you can find one, it's a decent one. They're fairly weighty. They don't feel cheap at all. They don't have any opening features, but you wouldn't expect that on a model of a Formula One car that was made not too long after the car was actually racing. Again, trade secrets in here, but it's not a bad one to have. The paint quality is good. It's a little bit difficult to see on this camera, I know, but there are some speckles there in the paint. Perhaps you can just pick up the shimmering effect there as it passes through the light. It is quite a nice little car. Glad to have it. Ferrari, they could have won the World Championship in 2010. Fernando Alonso came mighty close, went all the way down to the final round in Abu Dhabi, but he got stuck behind Vitaly Petrov for the entire race, more or less, and Sebastian Vettel was able to romp off to victory, and therefore his first of 4 Drivers' Championships. That brings me up to another point. We're in 2018. No matter what happens this year, we are about 99.9% certain to see our first 5-time world champion since Michael Schumacher did that in 2002. So here, sitting in the summer break, waiting for Formula One to resume, we're going to see a 5-time world champion this year. That doesn't happen much. The only people to do that to date, Michael Schumacher and Juan Manuel Fangio. So whether it is Lewis Hamilton or it is Sebastian Vettel equaling that feat this year, it will only be the 3rd time in history that a Formula One driver has done that. So definitely we have a lot to look forward to as we head toward the Belgian Grand Prix in a little while, and then we will close out the 2018 Formula One season. But a look from the real world model collection of mine and a look at a car from 8 years ago, but still it is a very nice one. Until next time, I do thank you all very much for watching. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you, and we will see you soon.